Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be covering a problem where we reverse print the elements of an array using recursion. And I'll say this from the outset. If you can understand how this works, you can solve a whole range of problems. So let's look at the prerequisites. As always, I just want you to have an understanding of JavaScript as well as ES6. And I would have hoped that you have watched the first video in this series, Intro to Recursion, or at the very least, have a fuzzy idea of what recursion is. Okay, so here's the problem. We want to print the elements of an array in reverse using recursion. But before we do that, let's look at a slightly easier problem and see if we can figure out that first, and then we'll come back to this one. Okay, here's the slightly easier problem. We're just going to print the elements of an array using recursion in order. And that brings us to the acronym B.A.R. We discussed this in a previous video, and it stands for base case, action, and recursion. And this is sort of a pattern that I use whenever I'm doing recursive problems. So I want you to forget the base case for just a second. A lot of the times, if we think about the problem, the base case will come organically to us. All right, so what's the action here? Well, I like to think, what is the purpose of the function? And the function is meant to log, right? And so we're logging the first element here in this print elements function, and then we'll pass in the tail of the array and so on and so forth. We're always just going to print the first element. So the question is, how do we move through the array? In the previous video, we said that we could do that with recursion and just changing the arguments, right? If we keep passing in the tail of the array, everything but the first element, eventually we're going to pass in an empty array. And that comes to our base case. So a lot of the times, our base case is determined by the arguments. It's not always, but most of the time it's going to be. Okay, so let's look at the left-hand side of our screen here, and I want you to follow my cursor. This big old cursor here. We have a mental model. Functions are boxes with memory. So you notice we have this function here, the same function, print elements, and we're going to call it below. Well, the thing to kind of remember is anytime you call a function, you're essentially creating a box that remembers all of the input, all of the arguments, and all of the code that was in that function at the time that you called it. So basically, everything in this block here, hopefully I can get that. Yeah, that will be remembered. So if you look at the right-hand side here, you can see that they kind of stack on top. So if functions are boxes with memory, then recursion is kind of a way to stack boxes on top of one another. Okay, so let's look at this more in depth and see what's going on here. So we're going to call this function print elements with an array of 1, 2, and 3, and we'll step through and determine exactly what's going to happen here. All right, so the first time we call this function with the array of 1, 2, and 3, it creates a box. Everything inside the curly braces is going to be our box. So we check our base case. We don't meet it. We're going to log the first element, which is 1, and we need to recurse. We're going to call print elements again with the tail of the array. Now it's important to note that this function, this whole function here, the whole block, from the beginning curly brace to the ending curly brace, this can't actually return or finish until this call right here finishes, right? So we have to wait for that to finish before we can, pop this off the stack. So print elements creates a new box, and that gets stacked on top. And notice, we do the same thing again, right? We check our base case, we don't meet it, we print the first element, and we're going to pass in the tail. And this whole function, this whole block, can't finish until this call finishes itself. So we pass in the tail, and then we get to check our base case again. We do not meet it. See, there's a pattern here. We're going to log the first element, and we're going to pass in the tail. At this point, it's an empty array. There's nothing else. And so we finally meet our base case right here because the array is empty, and so we return. Now this whole function here gets popped off the stack because there's nothing left to do. So we come to the third time we called it, or the prior invocation, and notice there's nothing left after this print elements function in here. So we ask ourselves, is there anything left to do in this function? And there's not. So it gets popped off the stack. Same thing here. After this function was called, there's nothing left to do. So we can free up this memory. It gets popped off the stack. And we come to the first time that we call this function. So we kept climbing down each prior function invocation, and we finally come to the first time we called it with the array of 1, 2, and 3. There's nothing left to do, and so we return. Okay, so how do we reverse this process using recursion? We'll focus on one way. It takes one change. All right, so we have two things on our screen here. And if you notice on the left-hand side, we have print elements, and that's going to just do that in order. On the right-hand side, we have print elements reverse, which you could probably guess at what that's going to do. What I want you to do right now is just play your best, guess at spot the difference. Right. So I'll give you a second to do that. Okay. Did you see what the difference was? Look at line 7 in both functions. On the left-hand side, we're just logging, like normal, right before the recursion. But on the right-hand side, in this reversing function, we move the console log after the recursion. So what I want you to do is write the print elements reverse function in your favorite text editor, or you can even do it in the browser in the console, and call it with an array of 1, 2, and 3. And you'll see it print in reverse. When I learned about this, it blew my mind. I had no idea how this was happening, and I had to tinker with it for probably a few hours actually before I actually understood what was going on. And it sort of takes a knowledge of the call stack, which, surprise, you kind of learned about already with the stacking of boxes. So let's look at this more in depth, and I think you'll see a pattern here. Let's see how this works. All right, does this look familiar? This is pretty much the stacking of boxes we were talking about earlier. But let's step through it. This is the first time we called print elements reverse with the array of 1, 2, and 3. And so, follow my cursor. We don't meet our base case. We need to recurse, but remember, we have to wait for this function call to finish before the entire function can finish, right? So we can't actually get to this log. All right, so we're going to pass in the tail. That creates a new box. We don't meet our base case. We have to recurse. We can't get to this log statement until this finishes. So we pass in the tail. Same deal. We don't meet our base case. We pass in the tail. We cannot get to this log statement yet. We need to wait for this to finish. The tail is an empty array. We meet our base case, which means we can return. This entire function stuff gets just popped off. That box is popped off the stack. We come back to the prior invocation, which is the array with 3 in it. So we're going to log 3, right? So that was the end of the array. Okay, so you can guess what happens next. There was nothing left to do, so we popped it off the stack. We come back to this. We log the first element, which at that time it was called with the array of 2 and 3. So we log 2, and we ask, is there anything left to do? And there's not. So this gets popped off the stack, and this might seem tedious and repetitive, but it's kind of good to go over. We come back to the first time, the very first time you called this function with the array of 1, 2, and 3. And we log 1. So we logged in succession 3, 2, and 1, right? And there's nothing left for this function to do, and so we return. So don't be afraid to struggle with that idea. It might take a few passes through. I encourage you to tinker. Write those functions in your in the console or in a favorite text editor, and log like crazy if you need to. But don't be afraid to struggle with that idea. It was hard for me at first, and if it is for you, don't feel like you're somehow behind or anything. You'll get it. It just takes a few times and some introspection. The other thing I think helps is try to think of an analogy and teach it to someone else. Even if you don't really understand it, sometimes trying to teach it to someone else, or a rubber duck, it could be anything. It helps, right? Because you're trying to think about the problem and thinking deeply instead of this sort of like cursory, I don't want you just to watch the video and just listen to me. I want you to, there's something actionable here. Okay, so here's another mental model, and I don't know why this is helpful to me, but it is. And I just call it winding and unwinding. So we're back to this print elements reverse function, right? And we're going to call it below with an array of 1, 2, and 3. And I want you to follow my cursor here. So we're going to call this function with the array of 1, 2, and 3. And we don't meet our base case, so we have to recurse, right? So we're going to go back in and call the function again. Remember, it creates a new box each time, but we're going to call it with different arguments. We recurse and we keep winding, we keep doing this, calling of the function and coming back to our recursion. At some point, though, we're going to meet our base case. And notice what happens to my cursor here. We return out, right? We come back to the prior invocation, we do some action or log, or return if there was nothing here, but we're going to log. And so we come back to this prior invocation, and we're going to keep doing this unwinding until we've basically climbed down that stack of boxes and just popping them off every single time. And that's it. All right, so hopefully you learned something. And if you did, leave me a comment below and don't be afraid to hit those like and subscribe buttons. And I'll see you in the next video. See you later.